General Hospital spoilers for Tuesday, February 3rd reveal that Willow had never planned to end up in Nina's apartment that afternoon. She didn't come seeking comfort, nor forgiveness, nor any of the fragile peace they had managed to build in recent months. But something inside her, restless, cracking, desperate, pushed her there. She stood by the window, fingers trembling against the glass, unable to calm the pulse beating violently in her throat. Nina watched her carefully, aware that Willow did not unravel easily. When she did, it meant something monumental was breaking. At first, Willow spoke in fragments, short, sharp pieces of thought that didn't seem to belong to one another. But then her voice steadied, and something deeper slipped through, a confession, a fear, a hunger for control she could no longer hide. She told Nina that she felt the world slipping away from her again, just like it had when she was sick, when she had nearly died, when she had lost months of motherhood she could never get back. She confessed that she could not bear the thought of losing more. Not her place in the family, not her children, not her identity as their mother. And then the truth came pouring out. Willow wanted custody back. Not someday, not eventually. Now, she wanted Wiley and Amelia with her full-time. She wanted her authority restored, her title reclaimed. The power she felt had been chipped away by circumstance, illness, and Michael's shifting loyalties. This wasn't simply a legal battle in her mind, it was survival. It was reclaiming what belonged to her. Nina listened, eyes wide, heart tightening as Willow's voice dropped into something darker, something less like grief, and more like determination. Willow spoke of adjustments, of needing to correct the imbalance, of feeling the universe had tilted unfairly against her since Jacinda entered their lives. She admitted she felt overshadowed, replaced, pushed aside by a woman who had no rightful claim to her children. And beneath every word was a simmering tension Nina recognized all too well, the quiet, frightening edge of someone who believed that desperation justified extremity. Willow insisted she was the only stable choice for Wiley and Amelia, that Michael was too distracted, too easily influenced, too blind to the dangers creeping into their lives. She said Jacinda's presence had distorted everything, making Michael forget who had sacrificed the most for those children. She said she could not stand by and let another woman step into a mother's role, while she was reduced to a visitor in her own family. The more Willow spoke, the more Nina realized this wasn't a simple custody concern. It was something larger, an emotional shift, a psychological recalibration. Willow's need for control had intensified, tightening around her thoughts like a fist. Her fear had hardened into determination. Her determination was slowly morphing into obsession. When Willow finally turned toward Nina, her expression was hauntingly calm, too calm for the storm swirling behind her eyes. She said she needed someone who understood what it meant to be cut out of a child's life, someone who knew how unbearable it felt to watch from the outside while another woman shaped moments. That should have been yours. Someone who had lost everything and had clawed her way back. She was choosing Nina as her confidant because Nina knew that pain. But Nina also sensed something Willow didn't say aloud, a dangerous undertone, an implication that custody wasn't just about legal rights. Willow wanted control of the narrative. She wanted authority. She wanted to erase the threat Jacinda posed, and she was willing to adjust anything, even her own moral boundaries, to make that happen. Nina, shaken, tried to offer caution, reason, grounding. But Willow wasn't listening. She was no longer speaking like someone seeking advice. She was declaring intent, a plan, a strategy already in motion. And that realization sent a chill through Nina's spine. Because Willow wasn't just preparing for a custody battle. She was preparing for war. A war that would reshape every relationship in her life. A war that would force Michael to confront truths he wasn't ready for. A war that might push Willow beyond the edge she had barely clung to for months. As Willow walked out of Nina's apartment, the air felt heavier, as if something unseen had shifted. Nina knew without needing further explanation that Willow's confession was not just emotional release. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. A new adjustment, a new turning point, a new storm rising in Port Charles. And Willow, whether she realized it or not, had already stepped into the heart of it. Michael sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, feeling the weight of every second press against his chest, as Chase circled him with quiet intensity. The detective's eyes, once familiar and almost brotherly, now held a hard suspicion that cut deeper than any accusation. Chase didn't waste time with pleasantries. He delivered the blow with cold precision. The PCPD was naming Michael as the prime suspect in Drew's shooting. The words seemed to drain the air from the room, leaving Michael suspended in a chokehold of disbelief. He tried to steady his breathing, but Chase pushed harder, laying out a trail of fragmented evidence and whispered tips that painted Michael into a corner he never imagined standing in. There were discrepancies in his timeline, unexplained gaps, and a supposed witness claiming they heard Michael arguing with Drew the week before the attack. Michael knew it was a lie, yet the level of detail suggested someone was actively engineering his downfall. What frightened him wasn't the accusation itself, but how calculated it all felt, as though invisible hands were reshaping the narrative to turn him into the perfect villain. At the perfect moment, Chase's tone only sharpened as he leaned in, asking why Michael had been near the docks, why he couldn't account for an entire hour, why he seemed so desperate to protect people who were now turning into liabilities. Michael felt the pressure building, felt the walls narrowing, and in that suffocating space he realized something was shifting inside him. This was no longer about defending his innocence. It was about understanding who wanted him buried and why, with Willow pushing aggressively for custody and Jacinda becoming an easy pawn. In this unraveling chaos, Michael began to recognize that he was standing at the center of a much larger, more dangerous adjustment in the story, one that threatened not only his freedom, but the fragments of stability he was trying to preserve. He sensed that Willow's desperation had grown into something unpredictable, something sharp-edged and volatile, and the timing of this accusation was too precise to ignore. The same woman who had quietly manipulated moments, who had been spiraling under the weight of jealousy and insecurity, now had every reason to dismantle Michael's credibility. The thought chilled him, yet he couldn't voice it, not even as Chase's questions grew more pointed and unforgiving. Instead, Michael let a new resolve take root, the version of himself who tried to keep peace, who softened conflict, who trusted too easily. That version evaporated under the heat of Chase's interrogation. In its place was someone harder, sharper, someone who understood that his survival now depended on seeing through deception before it consumed him. He left the station with the realization that this was the beginning of a brutal recalibration in his life, a new adjustment that would force him into battles he did not ask for but could no longer avoid. Someone wanted him to fall. Someone wanted him powerless. Someone wanted him broken. And Michael, pushed too far into the role of the hunted, was finally ready to fight back. Diane had always trusted her instincts, and in a city like Port Charles, those instincts were often the thin line between justice and chaos. But lately, something about the investigation surrounding Drew's shooting refused to sit quietly in the back of her mind. As she replayed the timeline, the testimonies, the convenient gaps in memory, a disturbing clarity began to take shape. Willow was not simply an anxious mother, fighting for her children. She might be the one who pulled the trigger. Diane kept this suspicion close, aware of how explosive it would be if spoken aloud. Yet every detail she re-examined pointed her back toward the same unsettling conclusion. Willow's behavior had shifted too abruptly, her emotional reactions too calculated, her presence too conveniently aligned with the moments leading up to Drew's collapse, and the syringe incident, once dismissed as a tragic misunderstanding, now echoed like a confession hiding in plain sight. But as Diane dug deeper, a new complication emerged. Alexis. Questions surrounding her involvement in recent legal maneuvers, her role in exposing Michael's alibi issues, and the strange timing of her courtroom strategies forced Diane to widen her investigative circle. It was as though Alexis had stepped into a narrative she did not fully comprehend, unknowingly weaving herself into a darker web of cause and effect. Diane sensed that Alexis's choices, although not malicious, had opened doors Willow could exploit, and that realization signaled the rise of a new adjustment in the unfolding chaos. Diane was no longer simply defending clients. She was uncovering a network of shifting motives, quiet manipulations, and dangerous intentions. The more she traced the threads, the more she recognized a pattern, a story being rewritten from the shadows. with Willow at the center and Alexis unknowingly nudged into a supporting role. This adjustment, subtle but powerful, threatened to reshape the entire legal landscape surrounding the Corinthos family. Diane understood she was standing at the edge of a revelation that could fracture alliances, destroy trust, and expose the truth about a woman no one was prepared to see as a threat. But Diane was prepared. She moved forward with precision, her suspicions sharpening into certainty as she realized that Willow's descent was not random. It was intentional, methodical, and far more dangerous than anyone around her had dared to imagine. And now, with Alexis unintentionally entangled in the fallout, Diane knew the time was coming when she would have to confront both women and expose the dark adjustment shifting the balance of everything they thought they understood. Jason had faced impossible choices before, choices that carved new scars into him, choices that rewrote the lines between loyalty and survival, but nothing had splintered him. Quite like Britt's trembling plea echoing in his mind, he had tried to shut it out, to force himself into the cold, disciplined clarity that normally guided him, yet her voice lingered like a crack across steel, refusing to be ignored. She wasn't just asking for help, she was begging for a lifeline, and Jason, despite every instinct warning him of the danger, felt himself breaking under the weight of her desperation. Britt had always been complicated, brilliant, reckless, wounded in ways she hid behind sharp wit and stubborn pride. But now, as she stood before him with fear hollowing her eyes and a confession shaking her breath, Jason realized she was unraveling faster than he could pull her back. She told him about Sidwell, about the threats that had stalked her for months, about the dark experiments her father had left behind, and the violent empire built on them. She told him Drew's shooting wasn't random, that the people behind it were circling closer, ruthless enough to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. And then she said the words that shattered him. She was next. Jason had sworn he wouldn't get pulled into her chaos again, not after everything, not after forcing himself to sever their connection for the sake of survival. But seeing her now hunted, exhausted, trembling with the knowledge of how little time she had left made every boundary he had built crumble like dust. Yet the more he listened, the more he realized that rescuing Britt wasn't simple. It wasn't a mission. It wasn't even a choice. It was a pivot point, one that threatened to unleash a new catastrophe across Port Charles. Saving Britt meant stepping into a war that had already begun in silence. Sidwell's reach extended deeper than Jason had imagined, and the network Britt described wasn't just dangerous, it was surgical, calculated, and prepared to burn down half the city to keep their secrets intact. By intervening, Jason would be exposing himself, Michael, Carly, and even Sonny to retaliation that could come without warning. And worse, Sidwell wasn't the only threat. Willow's instability was growing, creeping into corners no one else noticed yet, poisoning judgments and twisting alliances. Jason could feel the tremor beneath the surface, the sense that the Corinthos family was inching toward a fracture none of them were prepared to face. In the middle of this powder keg stood Britt, eyes shining with fear and trust, begging Jason not to walk away. He knew the risks. He could feel them pulsing in the air like a live wire. Saving Britt could cost him everything, but not saving her, letting her fall into the hands of the very people who had killed Dalton, who had experimented on Drew, who now saw Britt as the final piece in their unfinished work that was a cost Jason's conscience refused to bear. Yet his hesitation grew heavier as he uncovered more of Britt's truth. She had not only witnessed Sidwell murder Dalton, she had been part of the research. Unwillingly or not, tangled in a web of responsibility she couldn't escape. She was both victim and key, both target and liability. And Jason knew the moment he chose to save her, her enemies would shift their focus entirely onto him. The city would bleed for it. He would bleed for it. But Britt's voice, breaking under the weight of her fear, cracked something open inside him. She didn't beg easily. She didn't cry. Yet today, she was shattering, and Jason felt every fragment as if they were slicing into him. She told him she didn't want to die alone, that she didn't trust anyone else to protect her, that he was the only person who had ever pulled her back from the edge. And that was the moment he faltered, the moment his resolve buckled beneath the memory of who they had been, the closeness they once shared, the bond he thought he had buried. But there was a darker truth lurking beneath her plea, a truth Jason could sense. even if Britt didn't yet see it. Saving her would set off a chain reaction, pushing Jason into direct collision with forces far more dangerous than Cyrus or the WSB, or even Peter August. Sidwell's empire was built on silence, and Jason breaking that silence would turn him into their primary threat. It wouldn't stop at him. Carly would be targeted. Michael could be framed again. Willow's instability would surge under pressure. Jacinda, already vulnerable, could become an easy pawn. Britt's salvation would ripple outward, destabilizing families' alliances and power structures across Port Charles. But Jason couldn't walk away. He could feel the shift happening inside him, the adjustment he had tried to resist. He was being pulled back into the role he had sworn off: protector, enforcer, executioner if necessary. Britt was the match, and he was the gasoline. Together, they could ignite everything. And that was exactly what Sidwell feared. Jason knew that once he said yes, once he crossed that line with Britt, there would be no return to the shadows of neutrality. He would be declaring war. A war that would expose every secret, every lie, every manipulation, from Sidwell's experiments to Willow's unraveling to whatever else was festering beneath the surface. And yet, as Britt whispered his name again, pleading for a chance to survive, Jason felt the choice slip away from him. It wasn't a decision anymore. It was instinct. It was loyalty. It was the man he truly was beneath everything he tried to pretend he wasn't. He reached for Britt's hand not as a promise, but as an inevitability. And in that moment, Jason knew the truth. Saving Britt wasn't just an adjustment in the storyline. It was the beginning of the next disaster, one that he, and perhaps all of Port Charles, would be forced to survive, if they could. Britt felt the walls closing in long before she admitted it to herself. Every day, the shadows seemed to grow longer, tightening around her like invisible fingers pressing against her throat. Cullum's messages, Sidwell's threats, the constant surveillance she could sense, but never fully prove it, all merged into a suffocating storm she couldn't outrun. What terrified her most wasn't the danger itself, but the knowledge that this nightmare had started long before she realized it, rooted in the dark legacy of her father, Caesar Phazon. The research he left behind, fragments of formulas, experimental frameworks, neurological manipulations, had become a map for monsters, and Britt had unwillingly become the key they needed to unlock its final phase. The deeper she looked into Phazon's notes, the more horrifying the implications became. This wasn't just a scientific project. It was a blueprint for control, for weaponizing the mind, for manufacturing obedience through chemical precision. And Sidwell wanted it completed. Cullum was merely the messenger. Sidwell was the architect. Together, they were tightening the noose around her life, pushing harder, striking faster, treating her fear as a weakness they could exploit. The pressure was relentless. Every time Britt thought she understood the extent of their reach, they proved her wrong. Her phone glitches, strange cars circling her street, unfamiliar faces appearing inside GH, each moment carrying the quiet threat of a trap she hadn't discovered yet. And in the center of it all was her father's work, the one thing she had spent years trying to escape, but could never fully outrun. She hated that Phazon still had power over her even from the grave. She hated that she had inherited not only his brilliance, but the curse of being tied to a man who left a trail of terror across continents. The irony twisted like a knife. The very knowledge Britt had tried to bury was now the weapon her enemies used to control her. Sidwell believed she could finish what Phazon started. Cullum believed she would break under pressure. Both underestimated the terror clawing its way through her chest as she realized how little time she had left. Yet what made Britt's situation even more unbearable was knowing she couldn't go to the authorities, not when Sidwell had eyes everywhere, not when Cullum had enough evidence to frame her for crimes she had never committed. Her world was shrinking, room by room, breath by breath. The hospital corridors felt colder, the nights heavier. Every step carried the weight of someone hunted, someone marked, someone failing to stay a step ahead. And still, Sidwell pushed harder. He wanted the final sequence of Phazon's research. He wanted results. He wanted her. Britt could feel the collapse approaching, a moment where running would no longer be enough, where hiding would no longer protect her, where even Jason might not arrive in time. Her hands trembled every time her phone vibrated. Her stomach knotted each time she entered a room alone. She was living in a state of perpetual dread, a slow suffocation disguised as survival. And beneath that fear lived another truth, one she hated admitting. She was starting to understand why her father had become the monster he was. Power didn't corrupt him, fear did. Fear of being hunted. Fear of being outmatched. Fear of losing control. Britt could feel that same fear taking root in her, reshaping her thoughts, twisting her instincts. She didn't want to become him, but the pressure Sidwell and Cullum were applying made that distinction blur more each day. The diabolical beauty of Faison's legacy wasn't just in the science. It was in its ability to change people. And now it was changing her. Britt knew that if she didn't find a way out soon, she wouldn't just lose her freedom. She would lose herself. The danger wasn't simply that Sidwell would kill her. It was that he might turn her into exactly what her father had once been. And that terrified her more than dying ever could.